Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. I thought we would talk a little bit about protests this morning. Everyone knows about Hong Kong and what's going on there, but there are literally protests going on around the world, but several in Africa, Zimbabwe, Malawi, if I say that right, even Russia has been experiencing some protests lately. Of course, we have our in the United States, we have our weekly protests in Portland, but there's nothing that's been going on is quite as long as the 25-week worth of protests in Algeria. Jim, what's going on there?
Well, Algeria was one of the Arab states that, how should I put it, avoided or thought they avoided the Arab Spring. Tunisia, right next door, is where the Arab Spring actually started, and it was one of its few success stories. They changed the government, they got a new government elected, and it's still in business, which is something of a minor miracle. In Libya, they overthrew their long-term dictator, and they're still fighting. In Egypt, they overthrew their long-term, democratic dictator Mubarak. They elected a new guy from the Muslim Brotherhood. The radicals in that party said, "Hey, we want a Sharia law. The hell with all this other stuff." And he was overthrown quickly, and they got another Mubarak. A kinder and gentler Mubarak, but basically another ex-army officer who has Mubarak-like ideas. Meantime, Algeria.
Hey, Jim, Syria. Yeah. Syria was another.
Well, yeah, I'm covering North Africa.
Okay.
Just to contain it. Yeah, there's plenty. We can go to Arabia, Syria, but anyway, just in North Africa, there was no unrest in Morocco. Morocco is a special case because they have no oil, but they do have and they're a monarchy, but they do have a line of kings who have been remarkably efficient. Which just goes to show you, if you've got a monarchy and you don't get a lot of turkeys in a row, you can do pretty well. And Morocco has. They were one of the first Arab countries to cozy up to Israel, not counting Jordan, which couldn't help it. And they have basically gone out on their own, done it their way. And while they have generated more than their share of, recruits for ISIL and Al Qaeda and whatnot, most of them leave rather than try and, get something going in Morocco, which is very hostile. Now, Algeria, right next door, slightly different case. Algeria went through a bloody revolution against French rule. The French had ruled the place for about a century. Mainly, the French came in to eliminate the piracy and various other, forms of banditry, which had been going on in North Africa for centuries. And it got worse after Islam came along, and it became a religious duty to go north and rape and pillage and enslave Christians. The United States got caught up in that in 1812, anyway, the French finally said, the heck with it. We'll colonize them. Big mistake. They did colonize a lot of Algerians, but most of them they didn't. And it didn't take long before nationalists, Algerian, got most of the population up in arms, literally and figuratively. And the French were forced to leave. They could have stayed, but, politicians or people back in France said, hey, wait a minute. We went through World War II. We just had this mess in China, in Indochina with Vietnam. Enough is enough. And out they went. The FLN party, which is still in existence, then won elections, and they kept winning elections, sort of like the PRI in Mexico. They became incredibly corrupt, but because they had oil wealth, relatively more than Mexico has, they managed to buy their way out. Now, the special thing about Algeria was the Algerians did want free elections. I don't know if they knew about pre, but they did know, hey, look, the FLN, you were good guys the first couple of terms, but, you're basically, blocking everybody out, which is the usual drill for these, the dictatorships pretending to be democracies. And so finally they allowed free elections in 1990, and the Islamic parties, not all of whom were into Islamic terrorism, most of them were just Muslim Brotherhood grade, but you know how the drill goes. They made the boldest promises. They had the best organization at the mosque level, and they got elected. And the generals looked at this and says, this is not going to work. And they basically canceled the election, refused to accept the results. The Muslim parties, the Muslim coalition, thought they had the mandate and the majority, and they went to war. About 300,000 dead Algerians later, they were defeated by the end of the 1990s, and that basically immunized the vast majority of Algerians against Islamic radicalism. Well, to date, I mean, how much longer it'll last, it's hard to tell, because it keeps on coming back in Islamic history. But right now, basically the Algerians, especially the young and the unemployed, were unable to get into France in large numbers, and they were unable to get reforms in Algeria. And they didn't want another civil war like their parents had gone through in the 1990s, but they wanted change. And they got their opportunity when the current FLN, president, Bouteflika, who's been in power for about over 20 years, he had a stroke in 2013, 2 years after the Arab Spring. Now, at first, the government hushed it up. Oh, he was ill. He had to go to France or Switzerland, whatever, for treatment. But people began to notice he was no longer on TV. He was no longer giving speeches or public appearances. And it turns out he's 82 right now. He was in bad shape. And the FLN was trying to figure out, well, how do we sort this out? Now, at the same time that Bouteflika was having, health problems, the FLN was having political problems. I mean, how should I put it? They were divided. A lot of the army people, the army officers who had basically run the counterterrorism campaign during the 1990s and done it successfully, they basically were now in charge of the army, most parts of the army intelligence, national police, or what have you. They had stayed plugged into what Algerians were thinking. I mean, that's one way they won the war against the Islamists, who basically had a lot of fanatics going for them, but they also had a lot of large scale, widespread discontent. And there was a large faction in the military, in the security services, military and police, who believed that there had to be some fundamental changes in order for the government, the FLN or Algeria, to survive. And so year by year, especially starting after Bouteflika had his stroke and his minions began acting in his stead. His younger brother, a few senior army people who agreed with the how should I put it, the old school, show no ground, give no mercy, ignore the people. He started dismissing old timers. Now, this was something like, these are the people who were hailed as heroes for over a decade, and now they were being dismissed as suspects. Now, a lot of people figured it out. Again, we can thank the internet. That they don't have state-controlled media per se in Algeria, but the state can throw its weight around. Well, that doesn't work anymore. A lot of young Algerians were also in touch with their, compatriots in France, where many families have, cousins or their uncles or whatever. They have kin over there, and they can communicate very easily by the internet or with cell phones. And they basically got a more accurate picture of what was happening in Algeria from Algerians outside of Algeria. So they saw that they were being played, or people were trying to play them, and basically they got more and more steamed, angry, and finally, when Bouteflika, incapacitated, barely able to mumble his way through his speech, which he tried to a couple of times, said, "All right, I'll stand for election one more time." In other words, he was going to get reelected, whether he was giving speeches or not. One more 5-year term because, hey, blah, blah, blah. What he didn't say, but everybody understood, was that his cronies were still trying to figure out a way how to replace them without doing any damage to the FLN and all the corruption they were getting rich off. Everybody had figured this out by now. There was division inside the government as to how to deal with it. The reformers were being dismissed, some of them sent to jail. So finally in February, the demonstrations began, as Dan pointed out. They've been going on for 26 weeks in a row now. Salah, there were two people running the government in place of the incapacitated President Bouteflika. One was his younger brother, who was not really a politician, but he was organized. And he basically had been like the personal assistant for his older brother, but nobody seriously expected him to replace him. But there was the head of the army, a General Salah, who was an okay guy, but he was not really the same as the reformist generals that he had played a part in dismissing. And he basically tried to, how should I put it, keep the FLN in power while allowing elections. I mean, he was trying to do magic, things that really couldn't be done. And basically, a lot of Algerians called him out on it. Now, nobody is giving an inch so far. As we explained in strategy page, the army, I mean, the intelligence services, they still, monitor the chatter, the pulse of the people. And they realized that almost all the enlisted men, the troops, who are not all conscripts. I mean, a lot of people in the Algerian military, it's a good job, honorable job, so to speak, given how well the army did in the 90s. But there is still conscription to fill the ranks, and most of them are for the reformers. So if you ask them to fire on people they agree with, you know how that ends. Not well for the government. But they found Salah also found out that a lot of the junior officers and more of the mid-ranking, as had many senior generals, were also in favor of the Democrats in the streets. And the only thing that's keeping the demonstrations going for so long is the fact that Algeria has developed a way for people to keep negotiating. Now, they call each other names, and there is a lot of, how should I put it, manipulation going on, but that's why they're in trouble in the first place. But a lot of people, again, are adverse to another civil war, because even the kids, remember everybody lost somebody, and they're also, very hostile to Islamic radicalism, because they see what's happening in Syria, next door in Libya. They saw what happened in Tunisia, which, even though it's kept going, they're constantly hassled in Tunisia with Islamic terrorists. But then again, Tunisia didn't go through that inoculation procedure in the 1990s, which is a tough way, to educate the population about the downside of Islamic radicalism. So basically in North Africa, you have a population that is less, how should I put it, less prone to accept, Islamic radical type government. Now, Libya was something of an exception, but what you're seeing right now is the how should I put it, the General Haftar's Libyan National Army, which he literally started from scratch, in 2014 as an anti-Islamist. The tribes in the eastern Libya where he was they really wanted to get rid of Al Qaeda and this group and that group. They'd had it, they got a dose of that, and they wanted to get rid of it. And so emphatically, he was a former general for Gaddafi, who basically got run out with the help of the CIA. In the late 1980s, early 1990s. He's actually a naturalized American citizen. But he's seen democracy up front. He knows it warts and all. And he basically had a rapport with with Libyans. And he basically knows how to run a professional military campaign. So he keeps his casualties down. He's very systematic. He's very good at choosing subordinates. He knows how to wheel and deal politically. And he is now trying to take Tripoli, the capital, which is one of the last two coastal cities that he does not control. He controls all the oil. He controls all the oil export facilities. The UN still does not recognize him because he's been buddies with Russia. He's been buddies. Well, got all the wrong friends. The Americans back him now. And the only thing that's keeping Tripoli in the hands of the failed UN-sponsored government is Turkey, of all things. Turkey is basically Turkey is pro-Islamic Brotherhood, and anybody who is basically in favor of the Islamic Brotherhood, like a lot of the militias in Tripoli and Misrata to the east, the two major cities where the Libyan National Army does not control, they will back. That's a whole other story, which Austin is more of an expert on than I am. But anyway, Algeria is trying to work it out. That's the bottom line. That's the headline, which, of course, doesn't appear in media anywhere. The Algerians will probably work it out because basically you have a situation where the majority of your armed, your security forces will not fire on the people. And if you try and force them to do it, there are some units possibly that they could get to do it, but that just triggers a bloodbath, which Algerians, while they want to avoid it, they will defend themselves. I mean, they've been pretty brutal against the remaining Islamic terrorists. There was a small cell of ISIL operational. There were occasional outbreaks of Al-Qaeda over the last, 10 years, but they've been steadily diminishing over the years, and they get no mercy when they come up against the security forces. Cell phones are their biggest, enemy, because as more people in rural areas where they still hide out, the mountains along the eastern coast, people can just quietly, call the gendarmes, as it were, the army outpost, and say, "Hey, I saw such and such." Click, here, and that's made it almost impossible for them to reestablish themselves. So Algeria is seemingly a basket case, but they're not. They're still talking. They're still negotiating. The General Saleh is at this point. A lot of people are saying he's looking for a graceful way out. The FLN, one positive indicator was the FLN. That's the party of Bouteflika. They are still around. They're not going. They're not. They know they're not going to win in a fair election, but they are trying to, of all things, they're trying to unite with Islamic parties. Now, there are Islamic parties. There are still Islamic parties. You were allowed to have an Islamic party after the 1990s, as long as you, convinced the security forces that you were not harboring Islamic terrorists or anybody who's inclined in that direction. And they basically, the government understood we can't wipe this out entirely. We're an Islamic country. We're stuck with that, even though the Berbers are trying to go back to Christianity. The Berbers are a whole other story, which read strategy page. The people in the political parties realize they're going to have to work it out in Parliament, not on a battlefield. And so That's why FLN still exists. In other words, they've learned that you got to compromise. Compromise is messy. I mean, as Churchill pointed out, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. And the Algerians have gone through a lot of the others, and they say, okay, we got to do it the dirty way, which means we got to talk our way out of this, negotiate our way out of this, because we're sure as hell not going to try and fight our way out of it again.
Austin, what's your take on all of this?
Jim's given a detailed and both done a good job with both the line out the general issues and also some of the details and the key players. Jim, correct me on this, but wasn't at one time Saleh earlier this year promising that there were going to be elections in July, and that.
Well, yeah, all right, good point.
It didn't happen. It didn't
happen. Well, no, they have a constitution, which, if the president resigned or whatever, they automatically triggered a process where somebody next in line became interim president, and in 6 months they had to have elections. But the Democrats, the majority of Algerians, realized that the FLN, like the for a long time in Mexico and in other countries, had suppressed the other parties to the point where they needed more time and freedom to organize parties and basically, have a legitimate campaign, and that's what they're basically haggling over now.
Well, it's been one of the fact that the National Liberation Front, the FLN, did what you just described. In other words, it's hobbled all the other parties. Did allow the armed Islamic group of the 1990s was totally destroyed. But as you said, Islamism as in a political Islamist was still extant, and you have had smaller quote unquote fringe pro democracy parties, but the FLN really delegitimized or strangled in both all opposition parties. So you had a one-party state. Algeria, and you pointed out, talking about the modern communications, the fact they've got oil, and also their relationship with France. Algeria really, it's one of the funny things after its revolution and fight for independence from France, decolonization, admires France, and it has had an impact on even in the FLN. Sometimes you would see in Arab papers talking about Franco-Algerians, and they didn't mean the descendants of French and Algerians, talking about the Algerian elites, Algerian military that admired the French. Well, it's not just the Algerian military and Algerian elites. That has a middle class. Other Algerians admire the French system. So even though you'd had a one-party state run by the revolutionaries and then the second generation of the revolutionaries, you had information about what a democracy is like. And immigration, as you said, all their cousins or family members living in southern France, in some cases in northern France too, in Paris. And this is one of the strengths too that Tunisia had. It was remarked on in Tunisia that if you could get to it, wasn't just in Tunis, but throughout that country, is if we had some freedom and and an honest judiciary and could get rid of our corrupt elite. Some freedom, honest judiciary, get rid of our corrupt elite, we'd be making money because we would have tourists down here, and usually they would say tourists from Europe, tourists from France or Italy is what the Tunisians would say. Part of that had to do, again, with their long-term contact with the French, because Tunisia was a French colony as well, just like Algeria. That's one thing in play here that I think, Dan, is good. And it's one of the reasons is when Jim says, well, it hadn't blown up yet, hadn't gotten out of line yet. And gee, you start looking through the military, we know the lower ranks and younger officers are pro-democracy. Well, there are a number of generals that are too. What's that like? Kind of like Tunisia. That was one reason that Tunisia managed to pull it off, is that they had a more professional military, and some of their senior officers have the same kind of attitudes. That you see the reformist generals, a lot of them got fired. They haven't gone away. They still have relationships with the armed forces and with their former troops. So again, for reasons of, hey, we kicked the colonialists out, but gee, we like the colonialists, the former colonialists. That's one of the moderating forces I see at work here in Algeria. Now, Jim said the Berbers are a whole nother story, and he also mentioned the re-Christianization movement among the Berbers. I don't know what off the top of my head, what the percentage of Christians is in Algeria. I think it's 3 or 4% officially.
Yeah, they refuse to check it in the census. That's how scared they are.
I know that. I'm glad you brought that up. It's suspicious, and I read this. This isn't news. This is 15, 20 years old. Suspicion is that it's maybe a little bit more like Egypt, where at least 10 or 15% of the population is Christian. Coptic Church, meaning the Egyptian Christian. Maybe it's not 10%, but it approaches it, and some of that has to do with the fact that when the Muslim Arab armies invaded, ran across North Africa, they ran down the coast. They really didn't take control of the desert, and they couldn't. They went all the way to Morocco, and then crossed to Gibraltar. They didn't Islamize beyond the coastline. And who is out in the desert? The Berbers. Well, the Berbers were still on the coastline. That's another thing peculiar in some ways about Algeria, is that even among the Arab speakers, who are the majority vast of the country, and some of them identify as Arabs, ethnically they're Berbers. And Berbers are, as Jim pointed out in a recent post, are ethnically cousins of Egyptians, of the early Egyptians. They're native North Africans. And in the case of Libya and Algeria, also coming over somewhat into Morocco and with a Tuareg in Mali, they are still resisting the Arab invasion. And it makes for, in some ways, I'm not saying that this adds a peculiar danger to Algeria, no more than it has in Libya. But that Berber identity has never disappeared. The Berbers are highly suspicious of Islamic radicals. That was another element of the resistance to the armed Islamic group, and which was Al Qaeda-like, more like the Islamic State in some ways, because they intended to take control of Algeria. And anyway, to get back to the Berber identity, yes, there is an active group among Algerian Berbers to re-Christianize, and it's making a political statement. And it's making an ethnic statement. One of the things that has also reappeared in the. Did you say it's 25, 26 weeks now, Dan, of constant demonstrations? It's 6 months plus. Is Berbers waving a Berber flag, and also the fragmented Berber Party. I mean, the name of it is escaping me. It's a small, tiny faction. It's some of them favor independence. Again, it's a small number, but it is an interesting factor, particularly in Algeria, and they definitely are pro-democratic. It's one of the things that goes through throughout the population, which is that the admiration not necessarily directly for the French, but for democracy, because we want to get a break in our own country, and the only way we're going to do that is if we have a democratic polity. So you didn't ask me if I was hopeful, Dan, but the thing is, though, is I see the way the military's responded in this, and it's very similar to Tunisia.
Well, it sounds like it's a lot more hopeful than what's brewing on the border there at Hong Kong right now. That's for sure.
Well,
you mean the empire tends to strike back, but it's just interesting you mentioned China. China is a very different situation because they've been dealing with Berbers, so to speak, their version of Berbers, for thousands of years, and that's gone one of two ways. Either they absorb them, because if you look at the DNA test, it's showing there's a lot of groups that are now considered Han Chinese, or they basically run away. And so the periphery of China is basically full of these people who didn't want to be part of the empire. Now, the problem with Hong Kong is those are economic, refugees, as it were. And they are basically sitting on a gold mine. So it's more about money than anything else. We did an update. I did an update on Thailand today, and they are basically worried about Hong Kong because they understand that it's the fifth largest stock exchange in the world, just in Hong Kong alone. They have their own currency. And as we pointed out in our last podcast about Hong Kong, they are basically a special outlet to the rest of the world for China itself. They're going to take a big haircut, as they say on Wall Street, if they crack down, if they break Hong Kong, if they try and reassert their authority by force. And a lot of Hong Kongers are basically ready to just leave, go to Singapore, turn Los Angeles into another Hong Kong, whatever. Whereas in places like, North Africa, where there's oil, you still have an ethnic situation. The thing is that hasn't been mentioned, I think, is that the majority of people in North Africa are Berbers. Ethnically, due to DNA tests, they're Berber with a lot of European blood because of all the slaving they've been doing for centuries. I mean, that was always for a long time a big business. It basically went one way. I mean, they mostly went from Europe to North Africa, so they don't have, and the majority of people in Algeria are basically, genetically Berbers, but a lot of them are Arabized. But a lot of those who are Arabized understand that, they could easily, switch back. And the Berbers are trying to exploit that. They exploit the fact that we are all Berbers, whether you think you're Arabs or not, you're a Berber. In fact, another little interesting historical fact, one of the Roman Empire emperors was a Berber. I mean, that Berber North Africa was part of the Roman Empire for over 3 centuries. A pope was at least one pharaoh was a Berber. They did successfully come out of the Libyan desert and found at least one dynasty. You had a number of prominent, Catholic theologians and saints and what have you. Saint Augustine, for example, he was a Berber. So the Berbers have been very successful when they were basically cut loose, and that's all they want. They want their language to be recognized. As Austin pointed out, they're not big on independence. They're not like the Kurds. They got no illusions about forming a Berber empire because they saw how successful the Arabs were with that. They understand that the different Berber groups are nationalistically different. They have different dialects and what have you, but they do want to maintain their Berber heritage, their Berber culture, which has, for example, English speakers. They're all over the world, and the majority of them are in India. So, I mean, that just having the same language and a lot of customs in common, doesn't make you, one united people. And the Berbers long ago recognized that. So, what they're asking for is not unreasonable. In fact, the only thing that's unreasonable in North Africa, and this is why the Berbers are converting to Christianity, is they recognize Islam is a big problem because Islam intertwines, church and state. It's in their scripture, whereas the Christianity deliberately separates it. And that is an important difference, which the Berbers have learned the hard way. As long as you have a lot of Muslims in your country, you're going to have a radical faction develop, which is going to basically start another round of bloodshed. It's like I said, it's been going on dozens and dozens of times over the last 1,200 years, and nobody's found a way to stop it except to go back to old-time religions, whether it's the what do you call it, the fire gods in Iran. Or Christianity in North Africa, and of course that's one reason why Islam, says that anybody converting from Islam to another religion is subject to the death penalty. That's worse than heresy, and in many Arab Muslim countries, it's actually carried out either officially or by lynching. So you have a real fundamental problem with that the Berbers are simply trying to fix for themselves. And a lot more of people in North Africa, Muslims in North Africa, are realizing that, we have to come up with some kind of fix. And so this might be it. Just tolerate the large ethnic minorities, like the Turks are posting with their Kurds, and let's move forward. Because why add more problems to the problems we already have with a religion that constantly wants to unite, church and state, and a nurture that nobody really wants, even in the Islamic world.
Jim, I got a question for you. If they get that census out and they did ask the question of what religion are you, and we got honest answers in Algeria, what percentage of the country do you think would identify as Christian?
Could be as high as 10. In other words, if the government controlled the horrendous, how should I put it, opposition from the Islamic parties, even the legal Islamic parties, a lot of them would do it. I mean, that's why in Iran, in the in the round of demonstrations that have been going on since 2017, you have people out there saying, we want to get away from Islam. They have plenty of options.
No, I know that's what's going on.
And on the old religion, which names, I got a brain fart. But anyway.
Think you were after Mahdianism, I think, in Iran.
Zoroastrianism.
I think that's what you were after.
Anyway, the Iranians still practice a lot of the customs. Yeah. They just can't worship that particular god anymore.
Well, the Yazidis have a fire angel too, which goes back to the pre-Islamic.
Yeah, they made. There's a lot of small religions like that which barely survive in the Middle East. That's why they always live up in inaccessible hills. But now you got helicopters. But anyway,
I was going to say that I think in Algeria and I think I mentioned that 10% up to 10% too. It might be a little higher, but it's one of those questions that a lot of people aren't going to want to answer for the reason you said, because they open themselves to intimidation by Islamic radicals. So anyway.
Well, that's probably where we need to end it. We're up against our time, and it's been an interesting conversation today, and we'll have many more. We'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.